I never thought I'd have to protect my stepdaughter from her own father. But that afternoon, the air in our living room turned cold, and a single sentence changed everything. How do you react when the person you love most in the world crosses a line so terrifyingly thin that you don't even recognize them anymore? I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, caught between the man I married and the young girl who was looking at me with eyes full of a fear I'll never forget. In that moment, I realized that if I didn't speak up right then, our family would be shattered forever. And the silence that followed his demand was the loudest thing I've ever heard. They say that the biggest storms often start with a single, quiet breeze. For us, that breeze was a Tuesday afternoon in a house that usually felt like a sanctuary. I'm 33, and my husband Mark is 40. We've been together for 5 years, and during that time, I've tried my absolute hardest to be more than just a stepmother to his 15-year-old daughter, Lily. I wanted to be a confidant, a safety net, and a friend. Lily is a good kid. Typical teenage stuff, sure, but she's bright, creative, and just trying to find her place in a world that's constantly telling her who to be. Mark has always been a bit of a traditionalist. He's a man's man, provider type, and generally, he's a great father. He's protective, maybe a little overprotective at times, but I always chalk that up to him being a girl dad in a modern world that can be pretty harsh. But looking back, there were these tiny flickers of intensity in him that I think I just chose to ignore because I loved him. I loved the life we built. I loved the way he looked at me. But the way he looked at Lily that afternoon, that was something different entirely. It started when Lily walked through the front door after school. Usually, she's a whirlwind of energy, dropping her backpack by the bench and heading straight for the fridge. But that day, she seemed a bit more subdued, trying to slip past the living room where Mark and I were sitting on the couch, going over some bills and talking about dinner. She was wearing this denim jacket, but it was unbuttoned, and underneath it was a shirt she had clearly made herself. It was a tube top, hand-cut from an old t-shirt, and to be honest, it didn't fit well. It was jagged at the edges, slightly lopsided, and honestly, it just wasn't school appropriate. I saw it immediately, and I knew Mark would too. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Mark called out to her, "Lily, wait a second." His voice wasn't loud, but it had that edge to it, the one that makes you sit up a little straighter. Lily stopped, her hand gripping the banister. She didn't turn around right away. She just stood there for a second, her shoulders tensing up. When she finally turned, she had that defensive look that teenagers get when they know a lecture is coming. "Yeah, Dad?" she asked, her voice small. Mark stood up from the couch. He walked over to her, his eyes scanning her outfit. I could feel the tension rising in the room like physical heat. "What is that?" he asked, pointing toward the shirt. Lily looked down, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "It's just a top I made, Dad. It's fine." "It's not fine," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's sloppy, it's revealing, and you wore that to school? Do you have any idea how that looks? It's ill-fitting, and honestly, it looks like trash. You're not wearing that again." Now, I agreed with him on the principle. The shirt wasn't great. It was one of those DIY projects that just didn't land. I stepped in, trying to de-escalate the situation before it turned into a full-blown shouting match. "Lily, honey, your dad is right about the shirt," I said, keeping my voice calm and maternal. "It's just not the right fit for you. I think it's time to get rid of it. Why don't you go ahead and turn it into me?" I meant for her to take it off in her room and bring it down later, or maybe I'd grab it when I did the laundry. It was a simple request, a way to end the conflict and move on. Lily nodded, looking relieved that I had offered a way out. She started to turn back toward the stairs, probably planning to change into a baggy hoodie and disappear into her room for the rest of the night. But Mark wasn't finished. "No," he said, and the word cut through the air like a blade. We both stopped. Lily looked back at him, confused. I looked at Mark, wondering what he was doing. He was standing there with his arms crossed, his face set in a hard, uncompromising mask. "No," he repeated, looking directly at his daughter. "Take it off right here. Give it to me now." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Lily, and the expression on her face broke my heart. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a deep, visceral discomfort. Her eyes went wide, and she instinctively pulled her denim jacket tighter around her, even though the tube top was still visible beneath it. She shook her head, a tiny, frantic movement. "Dad, no," she whispered. "I'll go change." I said now. Mark stepped closer. "You want to dress like an adult and make your own clothes? Then you can deal with the consequences of your choices. Give me the shirt." I felt a surge of adrenaline, that protective instinct that transcends stepmother and goes straight to human being. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let him do this to her. No, I said, stepping between them. I made sure my voice was firm, even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. "Mark, she does not have to do that. Lily, go to your room, change your clothes, and bring the shirt back down to me when you're done. Go. Now." Lily didn't wait for a second invitation. She turned and bolted up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps retreating into the safety of the upper floor. Mark didn't move. He stayed right where he was, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had been standing. The silence in the room was no longer just tense. It was vibrating with a silent, brewing rage. I stood my ground, waiting. I knew the fallout was coming. I knew that by challenging him in front of her, I had broken one of his golden rules of parenting. But as I watched the stairs, waiting for Lily to return, I didn't care about his rules. All I cared about was the look on her face. That look of a girl who had just realized that her home might not be the safe haven she thought it was. A few minutes later, Lily came back down. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at Mark. She walked straight to me and handed me the crumpled denim blue tube top. I took it from her and gave her hand a small, supportive squeeze. "Thanks, Lily," I whispered. "Go ahead and get started on your homework. I'll come check on you in a bit." She nodded and hurried back upstairs, her door closing with a soft thud that felt like a period at the end of a very dark sentence. I turned back to Mark. He was still standing there, but now his gaze was leveled at me. The heat in the room hadn't dissipated. It had just shifted targets. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I know exactly what I did, Mark," I replied, folding the scrap of fabric in my hands. "I stopped you from making a massive mistake." "You undermined me," he snapped, taking a step toward me, "in front of my daughter. You told her she didn't have to listen to me. You disrespected my authority as her father." The air in the living room felt thick, like we were standing in the middle of a gathering storm. Mark was pacing now, his boots heavy against the hardwood floor. Each step felt like a hammer blow to the life we had built. He looked at me with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, as if I were the one who had crossed the line. It's a surreal feeling, standing in your own home with the person you're supposed to trust most, and suddenly realizing you don't recognize the expression on their face. He stopped pacing and turned toward me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Force her to undress? Stop being so dramatic," he snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "She was wearing a bra under that rag. It's not like she would have been standing there naked. It was a lesson, a way to show her that if she wants to wear something that looks like garbage, she can deal with the embarrassment of losing it right then and there. I'm her father. I'm trying to raise her to have self-respect, to understand that the way she presents herself to the world matters." The bra justification hit me like a physical blow. He actually thought that made it okay. He actually believed that because she wasn't literally nude, the act of forcing her to strip off a piece of clothing in the middle of the common area was a valid parenting technique. It was such a fundamental misunderstanding of boundaries that it made my head spin. I looked down at the hand-cut tube top still clutched in my hand. It was just a piece of blue fabric, a clumsy attempt at fashion by a girl who didn't quite know who she was yet. To Mark, it was a battleground. To me, it was proof of her vulnerability. "She had a bra on?" I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a scream. "Mark, do you really think that matters? The point isn't how much skin was showing. The point is the power dynamic. The point is that you were using your size and your position as her father to humiliate her. You saw the look on her face. She was terrified. She was uncomfortable. She was begging you with her eyes to let her go to her room, and you doubled down. You wanted to break her will. I wanted her to respect me, he yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the living room. I'm tired of being the mean guy while you get to be the cool stepmom who swoops in and saves the day. When I set a rule, you support it. That's how a marriage works. That's how a family works. You made me look like a monster in front of my own kid. And for what? To save her 5 seconds of discomfort? I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt a cold shiver of fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. I saw a man who was so obsessed with his own ego, so wrapped up in the idea of being the head of the household, that he had completely lost sight of the human being he was supposed to be protecting. He wasn't seeing Lily as a daughter. He was seeing her as a subordinate who had dared to defy him. You didn't need my help to look like a monster, Mark, I said, my voice cold and steady now. You did that all on your own. And if you think a marriage means I stand by and watch you emotionally abuse your child just so you can feel powerful, then you don't know me at all. I will never, ever apologize for protecting her from that. Not today, not ever. Mark let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Abuse? You're calling this abuse? You have no idea what real struggle is. I'm trying to keep her off the streets. Keep her from making mistakes that will haunt her for the rest of her life. That shirt was a sign of rebellion, and I nipped it in the bud. You're the one who's confusing her. You're the one who's telling her it's okay to ignore her father as long as stepmom says it's fine. The way he spat the word stepmom hurt more than I wanted to admit. I had put so much work into this family. I had stayed up late helping Lily with her homework, held her while she cried over her first breakup, and navigated the tricky waters of being a second mother with as much grace as I could muster. To have him weaponize my role against me in a moment like this was a betrayal I wasn't sure I could ever forgive. But I couldn't let him see me falter. I had to stay strong for Lily. I knew she was upstairs, probably sitting on her bed with her ear pressed to the door, listening to every word of this fight. I could almost feel her anxiety radiating through the floorboards. She needed to know that someone was in her corner. She needed to know that what had just happened wasn't her fault, and it wasn't okay. We aren't talking about her rebellion, Mark, I said, stepping closer to him, refusing to let him intimidate me. We're talking about your reaction. You could have told her the shirt was gone. You could have told her she was grounded. You could have had 100 different conversations with her about self-respect and fashion. But you chose the one path that involved public humiliation. You chose to make her feel small. Why? Was it because it made you feel big? Mark's jaw tightened. I could see the muscles working in his face, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. For a second, I thought he might explode, might say something that we could never come back from. But instead, he just turned away, his shoulders slumped in a posture of wounded pride. I'm going for a drive, he muttered, grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door. I can't even look at you right now. You've completely destroyed any authority I had in this house. I hope you're happy. He slammed the door behind him, the sound vibrating through the entire house. I stood there in the silence for a long time, the tube top still clutched in my hand like a trophy from a war I never wanted to fight. My legs felt weak, and I finally sank down onto the bottom step of the stairs, the very spot where Lily had been cornered just 20 minutes ago. The house felt different now. The shadows seemed longer, the air thinner. I realized that the man I had married, the man I thought was a protector, was capable of a cruelty I hadn't seen before. And worse, he was capable of justifying it to himself. He didn't see a father failing his daughter. He saw a leader being betrayed by his lieutenants. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I knew the night wasn't over. I had to go upstairs. I had to face Lily. I had to figure out how to explain to a 15-year-old girl that her father's love could sometimes be a cage, and that her home might not be the fortress she thought it was. But more than that, I had to figure out what this meant for us, for me and Mark. Can you ever truly look at someone the same way after you've seen them try to break a child's spirit? I looked up at the closed door at the top of the stairs. I could hear the faint sound of music coming from Lily's room, something low and melancholic. I wiped a stray tear from my cheek and stood up. I had to be the adult. I had to be the safety net, even if it meant the end of everything else. The stairs seemed to creak under my weight as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. My mind was a whirlwind of half-formed thoughts, the what-ifs, the should-haves, and the terrifying realization that the man I'd spent 5 years building a life with was a stranger to me. I reached Lily's door and hesitated. How do you knock on the door of a child you just witnessed being humiliated by her own father? How do you offer comfort when you're the one who just ignited a war in the household? I gave the wood 2 soft, tentative raps. There was no answer, just the muffled sound of music. I pushed the door open just a crack. Lily was sitting at her desk, her back to me, hunched over in that oversized hoodie she'd put on. Her shoulders were shaking, just slightly. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She didn't turn around immediately. She just let out a shaky, jagged breath. "Is he gone?" The question wasn't asked with curiosity. It was asked with a terrifying kind of relief. It hit me right in the gut. Is he gone? A daughter should never be relieved that her father has left the house. A daughter should feel safe, protected, and at home. My heart broke for her, a sharp physical pain that made it hard to breathe. I walked into the room and sat on the edge of her bed, leaving a respectful distance between us. "He went for a drive," I said gently. He's upset, Lily. He's very upset." Lily finally turned around. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red, and she looked so incredibly young, so much younger than 15. She had that look of a deer caught in headlights, that permanent state of waiting for the other shoe to drop. "He's mad at you, isn't he?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Because you stood up for me. You shouldn't have done that. He's going to make it worse for you now." I moved across the room and sat on the floor beside her chair, reaching out to take her hand. It was cold. So cold it made me shiver. "Lily, listen to me. He isn't mad at me because I undermined him. He's mad because he was wrong. And I will take that heat every single day of the week if it means you don't have to feel the way you felt downstairs." She pulled her hand away, not out of malice, but out of a sudden confusing burst of loyalty, or perhaps fear. "He says he does it because he loves me. He says the world is mean and he's just training me to be tougher. Maybe I was being stupid wearing that shirt. Maybe I deserved it." The word sent a chill down my spine. That was the most dangerous part of it all. The way a parent can gaslight a child into believing that their own humiliation is a form of love. It's a slow-burning poison. "Lily, no," I said, my voice firm but laced with a desperation I couldn't hide. "You didn't deserve that. You are a teenager. You are allowed to experiment with clothes. You are allowed to be silly or fashion-forward or even just plain wrong about what's cool. That is what being a kid is. But you are never, ever obligated to be humiliated by your parent to prove a point about authority. Your body, your choices about your appearance, those belong to you. And anyone who thinks they can demand you strip down just to prove they own you is fundamentally wrong. Do you hear me? You are not a possession. You are a person." She looked at me, really looked at me, and I could see the wheels turning. She was processing the dissonance between what her father had told her whole life and what I was saying in this moment. It was a pivotal moment in her life, a fork in the road, where she would decide who she wanted to trust. "He just gets so angry," she whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. "When he gets that look in his eye, it feels like the whole house is shaking. I just want it to be quiet. I just want him to be happy." "I know," I said, pulling her into a hug. She stiffened at first, then collapsed into me, sobbing. I held her tight, stroking her hair, feeling the rhythm of her heart slowing down against my own. I realized then that my role in this family had completely changed. I was no longer the stepmom trying to bridge the gap and keep the peace. I was now an active participant in a battle for her emotional safety. We sat there for a long time, the silence of the house finally beginning to feel peaceful rather than oppressive. But as the clock ticked toward dinner time, the reality of the situation came rushing back. Mark was still out there somewhere. He was coming back. And when he did, the conversation we had started downstairs would have to be finished. I stayed with Lily until she finally fell into a restless sleep, exhausted by the emotional toll of the afternoon. I tucked a blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and crept out of the room. The house was still empty when I got back downstairs. I walked into the kitchen and started making dinner, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something with my hands to stop them from shaking. I needed to be ready. I needed to have my thoughts clear and my resolve ironclad. Every time I heard a car pass by on the street, my stomach tightened. I replayed the argument in my head, analyzing every word. Did I handle it right? Should I have been softer with him? No, I told myself. If I had been softer, he would have just doubled down. He needed to be stopped. But where does the line between a tough love parenting style and actual psychological control lie? And at what point does a stepmother have the right to intervene so aggressively? I knew the internet would have opinions. I knew if I told people this story, they would call him abusive, or they would call me controlling. But the internet wasn't in that living room. The internet didn't see the way his eyes went dead when he made that demand. The internet didn't see the way Lily shrank into herself, trying to disappear. I looked at the phone on the kitchen counter. I wanted to call my mother or my best friend, but I felt this paralyzing shame. How do you explain to someone you love that the person you chose to spend your life with is someone you might need to leave? Then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the quiet. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up from the counter, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked into the living room. Mark was standing in the entryway, his keys clutched tightly in his fist. He looked exhausted, but his posture was still rigid, still defiant. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at me, his eyes scanning my face, looking for an apology, looking for a sign that I had come to my senses and realized I had crossed the line. I took a deep breath. This was it. Mark, I began, my voice steady, though my stomach was in knots. We need to talk about what happened today, and we need to be very clear about where we go from here. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and threw his keys into the bowl. I agree. We need to talk about why you think it's okay to treat me like a stranger in my own home. He walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the floor. The air felt heavy again, charged with the same electricity as before. I didn't treat you like a stranger, I said, meeting his gaze. I treated you like a father who had lost his way, and I will do it again if I have to. You think you're the martyr here, don't you? Mark scoffed, his voice dripping with a mix of exhaustion and genuine cold resentment. He walked past me into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, his movements sharp and calculated. You think you're the savior? The woman who stepped in to protect the poor, helpless little girl from her monstrous father. Do you have any idea how condescending that is? You have no children of your own. You have no idea what it takes to guide a teenager through this world, without her falling into every trap society lays for her. His words were meant to cut, and they did. They stung because they touched on the one insecurity I'd always carried in this role. The fear that, despite my love and my dedication, I would always just be a guest in their lives. Someone without the true authority of a biological parent. I don't need to have given birth to her to know when a line has been crossed, Mark, I replied, standing in the doorway, refusing to let him retreat into his own narrative. And I don't need to be a parent to recognize when a child is being intimidated. You aren't guiding her, you're breaking her. You're teaching her that her privacy, her comfort, and her autonomy are secondary to your ego. Is that really the lesson you want her to learn? Because if you keep this up, the only thing she's going to learn is that she needs to hide everything from you. He spun around, the glass clattering hard against the granite countertop. I am the head of this house. I provide for you both. I give her a roof over her head, an education, a future. And because I tell her to change a shirt that was objectively inappropriate, I'm the villain? You are so wrapped up in this modern, gentle parenting nonsense that you've forgotten what real respect looks like. Respect isn't demanded, Mark. It's earned, I said, my voice rising to meet his. And you lost a lot of it today, not just from her, from me. The room went dead silent. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, counting down the seconds of our marriage. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing, looking for a crack in my resolve. He was used to me being the peacekeeper, the one who would eventually apologize just to end the tension, the one who would suggest we talk it out later. But this time, I wasn't backing down. Are you saying you don't respect me? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm saying I don't respect the way you treated her, I clarified, my heart hammering against my ribs. And I'm telling you that if you think I'm going to sit by and watch you humiliate your daughter again, you are living in a fantasy world. I love you, Mark. I love this family, but I love my integrity more. I refuse to be a silent partner in whatever this power struggle is. He walked toward me, and for a split second, I wondered if he was going to grab my arm or shove past me. He stopped inches away, his face etched with a mix of genuine hurt and deep-seated stubbornness. You've destroyed the dynamic of this house. You realize that? You've effectively told her that she doesn't have to listen to me. You've signaled to her that it's open season on my rules. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? The damage was done when you asked her to undress in the living room, Mark, I countered, refusing to blink. I just stopped the bleeding. If the dynamic of our house relies on her being afraid of you, then the dynamic was already broken. I'm just the one who finally pointed it out. He looked away, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He was trapped in his own rigidity, unable to see past the insult to his pride. It was a terrifying realization. He cared more about being right and being obeyed than he did about the emotional safety of the girl we both claimed to love. We're going to talk about this later, he muttered, turning his back on me. I'm going to my office. Don't come in. He walked out, and the sound of his office door shutting with a heavy click felt like the final nail in the coffin of my naivety. I stood alone in the kitchen, the remnants of our dinner sitting cold and untouched on the counter. The house felt like a tomb. I sat down at the table and buried my face in my hands. The tears finally came, hot and fast. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was mourning. I was mourning the version of my husband I had believed in, the one who was kind, protective, and reasonable. I was mourning the dream of a happy family that I had worked so hard to build. And I was terrified for Lily. What was going to happen when she woke up? How would he treat her in the coming days? Would he try to isolate her? Would he double down on his authority just to prove he could? I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a shirt or for a moment of fairness. I was fighting for the soul of our household. I looked at the phone again. I knew I couldn't just sit here and wait for the morning to come. I needed to document this. I needed to talk to someone who could look at this objectively, someone who could tell me if I was crazy or if I was finally waking up to a reality I'd been ignoring for 5 years. I picked up my phone and started typing, my fingers trembling. I needed to reach out to a community of strangers, people who wouldn't be swayed by my love for him or his charm in public. I needed the cold, hard truth. As I typed out the story of what had happened, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't the stepmom. I was just a woman, alone in a dark kitchen, telling the truth of what I had seen. And as the words appeared on the screen, the realization crystallized. I wasn't the one who had failed him. He had failed the person who needed him the most. I hit post, and for the first time in hours, I let out a long, shuddering breath. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if my marriage would survive this night, or if it even should. But I knew one thing. I had done the right thing for Lily. And for tonight, that was enough. I waited for the comments to roll in, my heart doing a slow, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I felt like a detective staring at a crime scene that I had somehow been a part of for years without ever really seeing the blood. For the first time, I wasn't just Mark's wife or Lily's stepmom. I was a person standing outside of a glass house that had finally shattered. I scrolled through the notifications, my eyes stinging. One person wrote, "Run. If he thinks it's okay to humiliate his daughter like that, he doesn't see her as a person. He sees her as property. And if he's doing this to her, imagine what he's doing to you when no one is watching." Another said, "You aren't undermining him. You're parenting his child better than he is. He's looking for control, not respect. The bra excuse is the classic narcissist deflection. He's trying to make you feel crazy for having a moral compass." The words felt like ice water on a burn. I had been so worried about being the cool stepmom or the disrespectful wife that I had become blind to the fact that I was living with a man who prioritized his ego over the basic human dignity of his own child. It wasn't just about the shirt. It was about the power. It was about that moment when he looked at her, not as a 15-year-old girl who needed guidance, but as an adversary who needed to be conquered. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. The house was dead silent, but the air felt heavy with the unspoken consequences of the day. I walked to the door of his office, the one he had slammed shut hours ago. I didn't open it. I just stood there, staring at the wood, realizing that the person on the other side of that door was a mystery. Had I ever really known him? Or had I just fallen in love with the version of him he showed the world? I retreated to the guest room, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't bear to be in the same bed as him. I needed space to think. I needed to breathe without his judgment hovering over me like a cloud. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. The next morning, the sun came up, indifferent to the wreckage of our life. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, and there he was. Mark. He looked older, tired, and honestly, a little defeated. He didn't say good morning. He just looked at the coffee maker, his posture rigid. "We need to talk about what you did," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't an invitation to a conversation. It was a demand for a trial. "I didn't do anything, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I stood up for your daughter. If you think that needs to be talked about as if it's a crime, then we have a much bigger problem than a tube top." He turned to me then, and his eyes were cold. "You made me look like an ass in front of her. You've empowered her to ignore my rules. From now on, you stay out of my parenting. You want to be a part of this family? Then you stay in your lane. You're the wife. You're not the parent." His words hit me, but they didn't hurt the way they used to. Instead, they felt like a catalyst. A strange, calm clarity washed over me. I realized that the fight wasn't over. He was drawing a line in the sand, trying to force me back into a box where I would be complicit in his behavior. And for the first time in our marriage, I knew exactly what I had to do. "I am a parent to her, Mark, whether you like it or not," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I am the one she comes to when she's crying. I am the one she talks to when she's scared. And if staying in my lane means watching you bully her, then I'm done with that lane. I'm not just going to stay out of it. I'm going to be the voice of reason you're clearly failing to be." He stared at me, genuinely shocked. He had expected me to fold. He had expected me to apologize for being difficult. When he realized that wasn't going to happen, his face darkened. "If that's how you feel," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "then maybe you don't belong in this house." The silence that followed was absolute. He had said the words. The threat was out there, floating in the air between us like a ghost. He was testing me. He was waiting for me to panic, to cry, to beg for him to reconsider. He wanted to see me crumble, because that would put him back in control. I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I just held his gaze, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. "Maybe you're right," I said. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't know what to do when he couldn't control the outcome. He didn't know how to handle a woman who wasn't afraid of losing him. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't look back. I headed straight for the stairs, toward Lily's room. She was awake, sitting on her bed, looking terrified. She had heard us. She had heard every word. I walked in, and she looked at me with wide, searching eyes. She didn't ask what happened. She just held out her arms, and I went to her. We sat there, two people trapped in a house that was no longer a home, waiting for the next move in a game we never wanted to play. The silence that followed our conversation in the kitchen wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, and final. It felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the entire house. Upstairs, in the sanctuary of Lily's room, the world felt smaller, tighter, and yet, for the first time in years, the air felt honest. There was no more pretense, no more pretending that Mark's outbursts were just traditional values, or that his control was a manifestation of deep, protective love. We both knew exactly what was happening now. The facade had completely crumbled, and we were left standing in the wreckage of a life built on conditional affection. Lily didn't say a word as she clung to me. She was trembling, a rhythmic, fragile motion that told me more than 1,000 words ever could. She was 15, and she was realizing that the person she was programmed to trust, the man who held the keys to her childhood, was someone who could turn on her in an instant. I felt her tears soaking into my shirt, hot and desperate. I didn't try to stop her from crying. I just held her, my hands stroking her hair, anchoring her to the only piece of ground that felt steady, the truth. "He told me to get out," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. "He said that if I wasn't going to stay in my lane, I didn't belong here." Lily pulled back, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. She looked terrified, not for herself, but for the loss of the only stable figure she'd had. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice small and brittle. "I don't know yet," I told her, and for once, the uncertainty didn't make me want to panic. It made me feel liberated. "But I'm not staying here to watch you be treated like an object. I'm not staying here to be told that your dignity is something you have to trade for his approval. We're going to figure this out, Lily. One way or another, we're going to find a way for you to be seen and heard, even if he refuses to do it." Downstairs, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots on the hardwood. He was pacing again. It was his signature move, the physical manifestation of his inability to process a world he couldn't manipulate. He was waiting for me to come down, to beg for reconciliation, to offer the apology that would restore his sense of absolute authority. He wanted the status quo back. He wanted the world to spin on his axis again. I stood up and walked to the window. The morning sun was bright, mocking the dark atmosphere inside. I looked at my reflection in the glass, and I saw a woman I hadn't seen in half a decade. I saw someone who wasn't just a placeholder, not just a stepmother, not just a wife. I saw someone who had finally stood up and said, "No more." "Lily," I said, turning back to her, "I need you to listen to me. Whatever happens today, you are not the one who broke this family. You are not the one who destroyed the peace. You were just being a kid, and you were being yourself. Nothing about that is wrong." She nodded, though her gaze was still distant, clearly still replaying the moment in the living room. He wants me to be perfect for him," she whispered. "He wants me to be the daughter he imagined, not the person I am. I'm tired of being his project, Nachom." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. His project. That was exactly what it was. Mark didn't want a daughter. He wanted a reflection of his own standards, a person who would validate his ego by existing exactly how he demanded. And he had tried to make me an accomplice to that. I heard the office door open downstairs, and then the sound of his footsteps moving toward the stairs. My heart didn't race. It didn't stutter. It beat with a cold, steady rhythm that surprised me. I walked to the door of Lily's room and stepped into the hallway, just as Mark reached the landing. He looked up, his face a mask of cold, controlled anger. "Are you done playing the savior?" he asked, his voice low, vibrating with a tone that was meant to make me shrink back. "Are you done poisoning her mind against her father?" I stood my ground, leaning against the door frame, crossing my arms over my chest. I didn't look down. I didn't look away. "I'm not poisoning her mind, Mark. I'm helping her see the truth. You're the one who poisoned the well when you decided that your ego was more important than her self-worth." He took a step up, his eyes flashing. "You have no right to talk to me like that. You are a guest in this house. Remember that. You are here because I allow it, and you'll leave when I say so." His arrogance was staggering, but it was also the final piece of the puzzle. It was the moment the last thread of love snapped. I wasn't a guest. I was a human being. And I realized then that I had been a prisoner in my own life for way too long. "I'm not a guest, Mark," I said, my voice cutting through his intimidation like glass. "And I'm not waiting for your permission to leave. I've realized that being in this house means losing my soul, and I'm done with that. I'm going to pack my things, and I'm going to make sure that Lily has someone in her corner who actually cares about who she is, not who she's supposed to be." He stood frozen, his mouth opening to argue, but for the first time, no words came out. He was completely unprepared for the reality of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain in the form of her own freedom. The silence that hung between us on the landing was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that precedes a conversation. It was the kind that follows a death. In this case, the death of my 5-year marriage. Mark stood there, his hand gripping the wooden banister so hard his knuckles were bone white. For the first time in our history, he didn't have a comeback. He didn't have a lecture about house rules or respecting the head of the family. He simply stood there, staring at me as if he were trying to comprehend a language he'd never heard before. "I'm leaving, Mark," I said, my voice quiet, almost eerily calm. "And before you ask, no, I'm not having a moment. I'm not overreacting. I'm finally seeing exactly who you are, and I'm choosing to walk away from it." He finally found his voice, though it sounded strained, forced through a tight throat. "You're really going to throw everything away over a shirt? Over a simple parenting correction? You're going to walk out on our marriage because I tried to teach my daughter how to carry herself?" I let out a soft, humorless laugh that echoed down the hallway. "That's the difference between us, Mark. You think this is about a shirt. You've been looking at a scrap of fabric, while I've been looking at the way you treat people. It was never about the tube top. It was about the fact that you think you have the right to humiliate her to feel powerful. And when I called you on it, you tried to break me too." He took a step forward, his shadow looming over me, but I didn't flinch. I had spent so much of my life worrying about how to make him happy, how to be the perfect stepmother, how to keep the peace. That fear had been the chain that kept me tethered to him. Now, as I looked at him, I didn't see the man I'd fallen in love with. I saw a man who was desperately lonely in his own ego. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his voice dropping into that low, threatening register he used to control situations. "If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back. Don't expect me to be here waiting when you realize you've destroyed this family." "The family was already destroyed, Mark," I replied, opening the door behind me. I stepped into the room and closed it in his face, locking it. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. I turned to Lily, who was sitting on the floor, her back against the dresser. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, but there was a flicker of something new in them, a spark of realization. "You're leaving," she whispered. "I have to," I said, beginning to pack a bag. "But I'm not going to leave you behind to deal with this alone. We're going to talk to your mother, and we're going to make sure that you have a safe space no matter what happens." The next few hours were a blur of motion and raw emotion. I packed the essentials, the items that actually mattered. Books, journals, a few pieces of clothing that felt like me, not the woman Mark wanted me to be. Every item I put in that suitcase felt like I was shedding a layer of armor I'd been forced to wear. As I moved through the house, I could hear Mark downstairs. He was pacing again, slamming cupboards, probably trying to convince himself that he was the victim, that he was the one who had been wronged. He was practicing his side of the argument, drafting the narrative he would tell himself and the world to protect his fragile ego. But as I walked down the stairs for the last time, I realized that I didn't care what his story was. I didn't need to be the hero or the villain in his narrative anymore. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my bag heavy on my shoulder. Mark was standing in the living room, his arms crossed, staring out the window at the driveway. He didn't turn around when I walked up to the front door. He couldn't face me. "I hope one day you realize that love isn't about control," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "I hope one day you realize that your daughter is a human being with her own thoughts and feelings, and that your job as a father is to support her, not to mold her into a weapon for your own ego. Because right now, you're losing the people who actually love you, and you don't even seem to notice." He didn't move. He didn't turn. He just kept staring out at the empty driveway. I walked out of the house and didn't look back. The air outside was cool and crisp, and it felt like I was breathing for the first time in years. As I got into my car and started the engine, I felt a wave of relief so intense it brought me to my knees. Or it would have if I hadn't been sitting in the driver's seat. I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving a cage. I looked at the house in my rearview mirror. The beautiful, expensive, suffocating house. It looked smaller now, insignificant. I realized then that my life was my own again. I had spent years trying to fit into a life that was never meant for me, and in the process, I'd nearly lost myself. I put the car into gear and drove away. I didn't know where I was heading or what the legal fallout would be, or how I would navigate the next few weeks. But for the first time in a long time, the road ahead wasn't defined by someone else's rules. It was mine. As I drove, I thought about all the people who might be reading this, wondering if they're in the same kind of cage. To anyone listening, if you're in a situation where your dignity is being traded for authority, if you're being made to feel small so someone else can feel big, please know that you don't have to stay. You don't have to justify your departure to anyone but yourself. Your safety and your self-worth are not negotiable. I'm curious, what would you have done? Would you have stayed to try and fix it? Or would you have walked out just like I did? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you've ever had to make a choice that changed your entire life in an instant, I'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to follow along with what happens next. The sun was setting as I hit the highway, casting a golden light over everything. It felt like a new beginning. The drive was, in a strange way, the most peaceful experience of my life. For years, my car had been a vessel for errands, for grocery runs, for picking up supplies for the perfect home I was trying to maintain. Tonight, it was a chariot of liberation. The city lights began to blur in my periphery, glowing like embers as I put more distance between myself and the house. Every mile I traveled, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, the phantom pressure of needing to be the mediator, the peacekeeper, the woman who absorbed the impact of Mark's temper so that Lily didn't have to. I pulled into a motel parking lot just outside the city limits. It wasn't the kind of place I would have ever considered staying in before. Dated, modest, quiet. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. I stared at the dashboard, wondering what the hell I had just done. I had walked out on 5 years. I had walked out on the life I told everyone, including myself, was the dream. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. It was a text from Mark. "You're really doing this? You're going to walk out over one argument? You're acting like a child. Grow up and come home." I didn't even flinch. I didn't feel the surge of guilt or the need to defend myself that he clearly expected. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. He was still trying to use the same old tools, the guilt tripping, the condescension, the projection, but the tools were broken. I was no longer a person who could be manipulated by the word childish. I had spent 5 years being the adult in the room while he played the part of the tyrannical child, and I was finished with the role play. I blocked his number. The act was so simple, so mundane, yet it felt like a seismic shift in my reality. No more demands for explanations. No more waiting for his permission to be myself. I walked into the motel office, signed the register with a name that felt like my own for the first time in years, and took the key to my room. Inside, the space was sparse. A bed, a small desk, a television that likely hadn't seen a clear signal in a decade. It was the antithesis of the curated life I'd left behind, and for that reason, it felt like the most honest place I'd ever been. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally, truly, breathed. My thoughts drifted back to Lily. That was the only part of this that kept me awake. I knew I couldn't just vanish and leave her to bear the brunt of his redirected anger. I had already set the wheels in motion before I left. A call to her mother, who lived 3 states away. We had talked briefly earlier in the afternoon. She had been shocked, then furious, and finally, deeply grateful that I had been there to witness what was happening. We had a plan. Lily was going to be safe. That was the only victory that mattered. As the night deepened, I began to replay the last few days in my mind. Not just the incident with the shirt, but the accumulation of small, almost invisible moments. The way Mark would interrupt me in conversations with friends, the way he'd subtly criticize the things I enjoyed, the way he'd constantly frame his decisions as for our own good. It was a slow motion unraveling. I realized that the argument about the shirt wasn't a catalyst. It was the final straw. It was the moment that forced me to look at the patterns I had been ignoring because I was too afraid to be alone. I realized then that people don't change when they are comfortable. They change when the cost of staying exactly the same becomes too high. For me, the cost had become my self-respect, my integrity, and my ability to look at myself in the mirror without feeling like a fraud. I picked up my laptop and opened the forum where I had posted my story. The comments were still flooding in, hundreds of them, from people who had been through exactly the same thing. They spoke of the boiling frog syndrome, how you don't notice the water getting hotter until you're already scalded. They shared stories of leaving toxic marriages, of breaking free from controlling partners, of finding their voices again after years of being silenced. One comment caught my eye. You aren't just saving the stepdaughter. You're saving the woman you were supposed to be before you met him. Don't look back. There is nothing there but a ghost of who you used to be. I closed the laptop and lay back on the thin motel pillows. The silence of the room was comforting. It was a silence I had earned. I thought about the thousands of people who would listen to this story, who would wonder if the life they were living was really the one they chose. If you are listening to this and you feel that tightness in your chest, that persistent, nagging feeling that you're living in a cage, even if the bars are invisible, please listen to me. You do not have to be a victim of your own circumstances. You have a right to your own body, your own dignity, and your own life. And you don't need anyone's permission to reclaim it. I knew tomorrow would be a whirlwind. There would be lawyers, there would be awkward conversations, there would be the logistical nightmare of untangling 5 years of shared existence. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the work. I was excited by the future. The sun began to peek through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting a soft orange glow over the floor. It was a new day, and for the first time in 5 years, it was entirely, unapologetically mine. The next morning, the sunlight didn't feel intrusive. It felt like an invitation. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, watching the dust motes dance in the light, feeling a profound sense of stillness. The chaos of the last 48 hours had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. My phone, which had been buzzing incessantly the night before, was finally silent. I had blocked Mark, but I had also left a single final message for his sister, someone who had always been a bridge of reason in our chaotic family dynamic. I didn't need to explain myself to him anymore. I only needed to ensure that Lily had a safety net. By noon, I was at a local cafe, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted better than any I'd ever brewed in that granite countertopped kitchen. My laptop was open, and I was drafting a list. It wasn't a to-do list of chores or errands. It was a list of things I had stopped doing because it wasn't worth the fight. I was reclaiming the small, seemingly insignificant parts of myself that I had traded away to keep the peace. I missed reading late into the night without being told to turn the lights off because he wanted to sleep. I missed wearing clothes that felt like me, not just appropriate versions of myself. I missed the sound of my own voice when I wasn't filtering it through the lens of what would keep him from losing his temper. As I sat there, the weight of the last 5 years began to dissipate, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating realization of true autonomy. I wasn't just a stepmother anymore. I was a person who had recognized her own value, even when it was being stripped away by the person who had sworn to protect it. I thought about the thousands of you out there who have likely been in similar shoes. Maybe you're there right now, reading or listening to this, wondering if it's really that bad. I want you to hear this. That bad isn't a threshold you have to reach before you're allowed to leave. You don't need bruises to prove you've been hurt. Sometimes, the most damaging kind of abuse is the slow, grinding erosion of your personality. It's the way you start apologizing for things you didn't do. It's the way you start shrinking yourself to fit into the spaces someone else creates for you. And if you're living in a house where you feel like you have to walk on eggshells, or where you have to constantly defend the dignity of others just to feel like a decent human being, you are already living in a cage. I checked my phone once more just to make sure there weren't any emergencies regarding Lily. There was a message from her mother. "She's safe. She's with me. Thank you for being the one person who finally saw her and defended her." That was it. That was the validation I didn't know I needed. All the doubt, all the what ifs, all the agonizing over whether I had handled things appropriately, it evaporated. I had done the right thing. Not for the marriage, not for the traditional family structure, but for the human being who had been trapped in the middle of it. I looked out the cafe window at the passing cars. Everyone was moving, going somewhere, living their lives. And for the first time, I felt like I was part of that world again, rather than a spectator standing behind a window in a house that didn't feel like home. The process of untangling my life, the bank accounts, the joint lease, the shared belongings, would be long and arduous. I knew that. Mark was not the kind of man to let go of control easily. He would likely try to paint me as the villain, as the woman who abandoned the family for a trivial reason. But let him spin his story. I had the truth, and for the first time, I realized that the truth is an armor that no amount of spin can pierce. I decided then that I would start a new chapter. I wasn't going to look back at the wreckage. I was going to move forward, one step at a time, toward a life that was defined by my own terms. I wanted to ask you all, have you ever had to walk away from everything you knew because the price of staying was your own soul? How did you find the strength to do it? If this story has resonated with you, if it sparks something that you've been trying to bury, please share your thoughts. There is a community here of people who understand, and sometimes just saying it out loud or typing it out for the world to see is the first step toward freedom. If you haven't yet, consider subscribing to this channel. We're going to be talking a lot more about boundaries, about the courage it takes to leave, and about how to rebuild when you've had to start from zero. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and stood up. The air outside felt warmer, clearer. I walked toward my car, not as a woman running away, but as a woman moving toward her own future. I didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in 5 years, I was the one holding the wheel. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale ending, but they were a beginning. There is this misconception that once you leave a toxic environment, the trauma just evaporates, as if you've walked through some sort of metaphysical car wash that cleanses you of the past. But that's not how it works. You take the pieces with you. You take the habits of apology, the constant scanning for signs of someone else's temper, the lingering fear that you're somehow doing it wrong. But there was one major difference. I was now the one in charge of my own healing. I wasn't being gaslit into believing my trauma was a figment of my imagination or a symptom of my own failures. I moved into a small apartment, a place that was, for the first time in my adult life, decorated exactly how I wanted. No compromise. No, this doesn't fit the aesthetic of our life. No, this isn't what a home should look like. Just me. And in that apartment, I started to rebuild. I started to pick up the hobbies I'd abandoned when they were deemed a waste of time. I started to rediscover what I liked to eat, what time I liked to wake up, how I like to spend my Sundays. It sounds so small, doesn't it? Choosing your own coffee mug or deciding what color to paint a wall. But when you've spent 5 years in a marriage where your choices were constantly filtered through someone else's ego, these small acts are acts of rebellion. They are acts of self-reclamation. Lily and I stayed in touch. Her mother had taken over the reins, and I became the auntie, the safe harbor, a role that allowed me to support her without having to navigate the wreckage of her father's household. She's doing better. She's finding her own style, wearing the clothes she wants, and most importantly, she's learning that her value as a human being isn't tied to someone else's approval. That was the real win. That was the victory that made every sleepless night and every difficult conversation worth it. Mark, on the other hand, stayed exactly where he was. He remained in that big, beautiful, sterile house, surrounded by his rules and his bitterness. I heard through the grapevine that he's still the same, still searching for the person who will play the role he's cast for them, still blaming the world for the fact that his ideal family fell apart. But his story isn't mine anymore. I stopped reading his chapters months ago. I look back at the tube top incident now, and it feels like a lifetime ago. It's strange, isn't it? How one single moment, the sight of a teenager being treated like a subordinate, can be the catalyst that burns down a house of cards you've been building for years. I often wonder what would have happened if I had just stayed quiet that afternoon. If I had let him take the shirt. If I had apologized to him later. If I had played the role of the submissive wife just to keep the peace. Would I still be there? Probably. And I would have withered. I would have slowly turned into a ghost in my own hallways. A person whose only purpose was to serve as a mirror for his pride. Leaving wasn't just about the shirt. It was about the realization that my life had a price, and I wasn't willing to pay it anymore. If you are listening to this right now, and you are in that same position, if you feel the walls closing in, if you feel like you're constantly shrinking just to keep someone else comfortable, listen to me closely. You are not a prop in someone else's life. You are the lead in your own. And if you have to walk away from everything you know to save your spirit, then walk. The road might be lonely at first, and the silence might be loud, but it is 1,000 times better than the noise of a life that isn't yours. I'm sitting here, writing this, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel a need to explain my actions to anyone. I don't feel the need to justify my worth. I am enough. And so are you. I've learned that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. When you betray that, you betray everything. I'm finally home, not in a house, but in my own skin. Looking back at the trajectory of my life since that Tuesday, I realized that the most difficult part wasn't leaving. It was the process of deprogramming myself. For 5 years, I had been an understudy in Mark's production of A Perfect Family. Every time I'd try to speak up, I'd be silenced with a look, a comment about my tone, or a lecture on how I was destabilizing the hierarchy. You don't just wake up one day and suddenly stop hearing those voices in your head. For weeks after moving out, I found myself apologizing to the air when I spilled coffee, or double-checking the locks, or even feeling a phantom pulse of anxiety whenever my phone rang, instinctively expecting it to be him with a list of demands. It took time, but the silence in my new apartment slowly stopped feeling like a void and started feeling like a sanctuary. I started to notice things I hadn't seen in years. I noticed the way the morning light hit my kitchen table. I noticed the books I actually wanted to read, rather than the ones I thought I should be interested in. I rediscovered the person I was before I became a stepmother, the person who had hobbies, dreams, and opinions that weren't subject to someone else's approval. The most profound shift, though, was in my relationship with Willie. Because I wasn't there as the quote-unquote parent, trying to enforce rules or mediate conflict, our dynamic changed into something much more honest. We talk now, really talk. She tells me about the things she's actually interested in, her art, her music, the things that made her her, without the fear that her father would label them rebellious or trashy. She's flourishing. She's finally allowed to just be a teenager, and seeing the light return to her eyes, is the greatest gift I've ever received. It's a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do for the people you love is to stop being a bystander to their harm. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Mark is still struggling. He's still trying to project that same image of authority, still insisting that his rules are the only ones that matter. But without someone to play the part of the compliant partner, the image isn't holding together very well. It's a sad reality, but it's not my reality anymore. I've realized that people who are obsessed with controlling others are rarely ever in control of themselves. They're usually just terrified, clinging to the only way they know how to interact with the world, through dominance. My story isn't one of grand tragedy. It's one of quiet, radical recovery. I want to leave you with this. The life you are living right now, the one you think you have to accept, the one you think you have to endure, is only one version of your story. You have the power to change the narrative. You have the power to put down the weight that someone else has forced you to carry. And it doesn't have to be a loud, dramatic exit if you aren't ready. Sometimes the most important work happens in the small, daily choices to say no to things that don't serve your dignity. If you're listening to this and you feel like you're waiting for a sign, or for a moment that's big enough to justify standing up for yourself, let this be it. You don't need a massive, life-shattering argument to realize that you deserve better. Your worth is inherent. It's not something you have to earn, and it's certainly not something you have to defend against the people who are supposed to be your biggest supporters. I hope that by sharing this, I can help someone else see that there is life on the other side of the perfect family facade. It's not always easy, and it's definitely not always pretty, but it's yours. And that's the most beautiful thing in the world. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to reclaim your life from someone who tried to shrink it, please share your journey in the comments. We are stronger when we realize we aren't alone. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more stories about boundaries, self-worth, and moving forward, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us build this community of support, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. I'm finally at peace, and I truly hope that if you're searching for yours,